Hello, my name is Malcolm Fryer from Malcolm Fryer Architects. I am obviously an architect. I was also an SPAB scholar in 2002. And we have the honour and the privilege of having been appointed as the architects to work with the SPAB on the Old House project at St Andrew's Chapel in Boxley. We were appointed about last September, and we've been working closely with a working group at the SPB, as well as a huge number of consultants and specialists that have been and volunteers who have been interested in the project, and it has been an absolutely wonderful experience so far. And I am hoping to give you a general taste of the work that we've been doing over the last 9 months, and the work that's going on at the moment, and what we're hoping to achieve in the future. So, as I say, Malcolm Fryer Architects, we're a small team of architects who specialise in historic building repair and adaptive reuse. There are 4 scholars on the team at the moment. There's Susie, who I think was from 2001, Susie Whitmore, who's done a lot of the historical research, Christian Foster, who was a scholar, I think, in 2016, and George Hodgson, who's a scholar in 2017, as well as a couple of aspiring scholars in the team as well. So yes, motley crew, and we're all involved in the project in one way, shape or form. So I'm not going to repeat too much of the previous presentations by Matthew and Graham, but I do think it's worth just reiterating the aims of the Old House project for the SPB. I mean, first and foremost, it is to repair a building at risk. The building has not been occupied. It is a disused house. It's a disused many things, but most recently it was a residence. But it hasn't been occupied for a long time, and it's on the buildings at risk register. And to repair it very much in accordance with the SPB approach, which I will talk about a bit more in more detail. Also to think about and delivering an educational and training program is a really important part of the project, and a lot of our work has been really thinking about how we can optimize that. And very importantly, it's to produce a domestic building that is saleable at full market value once repaired. It's a huge part of our work is about viability, feasibility, and making sure that the way that we repair and adapt buildings is very much about viability and saleability. Getting the balance right is a very difficult thing, especially when you think about the sustainability considerations. I mean, often being an exemplar of the SPB approach to repair is often in conflict with being an exemplar in environmental terms. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But getting the balance between those aims is what the project is all about. Our role so far has been about a lot of historical research and pulling together a lot of archaeological paint analysis, a huge amount of archival of information to really try to bring it all into one place and having a suitable historical understanding. Before we even start work, it's absolutely essential to really understand what is so important about the place. And then summarizing significance and why is this place, why is St Andrews so important, and why? And that's, again, a really important thing to do before we even start work on a project. We have carried out a fairly detailed condition survey of the building to really get an understanding of not only the superficial problems, but some of the problems which may be a little bit more hidden, particularly some of the structural movement problems. Again, working with a wonderful engineer, Justin McAteer, who's done, and Peter Egan, who've been doing a lot of structural monitoring and trying to really understand what is going on with the building, and then putting together repair proposals which promote the SPB approach to low intervention and retaining as much fabric as we can. So then thinking a bit more about getting the building back into residential use, the delights of plumbing and services and toilets and ventilation, all those kinds of things, but making it a viable project in itself. and thinking then a lot about the sustainability and environmental improvements, how we can get this balance right between both being an exemplar of conservation and an exemplar of sustainability. And often there is a conflict there, but how we can get that balance right, and often the two do work very much hand in hand. And then we spent a lot of time exploring the potential for sort of sensitive and sustainable development of the site. It is quite a small property on quite a large site, and certainly the need for ancillary accommodation, but also potentially some further living accommodation, and even the thought of maybe having a second dwelling on the site. So they're the kinds of things that we've been exploring as part of the viability. Then very importantly, looking at educational opportunities for the project, which is about materials, the types of craftsmanship that may be involved, how we source materials, how we source lime, and really just looking to optimize as much as we can from the project in terms of sharing shared experience and working with the technical panel, bringing the technical panel of the SPB to site, working through some of the issues and really coming up with what we believe to be the absolutely the right SPAB approach to the project. We've also been liaising with the statutory authorities, Historic England and Maidstone, and obviously the amenity groups such as the SPAB. But yeah, working. We had we're now at what we call the pre-application stage, where we meet with Historic England and the local authority, and they give us their feedback initially on our proposals, and we're responsible for that process. And then we've also been detailing and overseeing the urgent repairs on a like-for-like basis, things we can do which don't require a list of building consent, things like the roofing repairs, which are going to be happening next week. So I think that's your only bullet points. Actually, there's a couple more, but I'll try to keep them brief. But I'm not going to go too much over the history that I think Matthew has dealt with in one of the previous talks. But really, just to reiterate the significance about the origins of the chapel as part of Boxley Abbey, as very much being sort of close to the outer gatehouse, and on the outer limits of Boxley Abbey, but very much part of a pilgrim's trail. And what the chapel may have housed as part of that pilgrim's trail is not known, but there are all sorts of theories. But very important as part of this pilgrim's trail through Kent, and how that has evolved over time in its relation to Boxley Abbey proper. So the chapel is here on the outer precinct, with the abbey within the inner precinct, and how this has evolved over time as the abbey was converted and the lands changed. But the chapel has always held this really pivotal point in this junction of several important roads, and so really just trying to get an understanding of its relationship to the abbey and its precincts, and then looking at other comparative examples of Cistercian gatehouse chapels. I mean, this gives you a sense of the scale that we're dealing with. So obviously examples around the country: Coggeshall, Croxton, Revo. Revo is probably the most comparable in terms of size to Boxley, but really very, very small in comparison to some of the other ones that exist today. So what we see here in green is what remains of the abbey, the gatehouse chapel, and what makes Boxley unique is that it had this priest lodging, which it's fairly certain was attached to the chapel from its origins, which makes it quite unique, but does suggest maybe a little bit about its nature and its location at that key location in the approach to the abbey. There's also, interestingly, a timber-framed element attached, which could predate the abbey, but again, sorry, the chapel, which would again make it very unusual compared to the other comparative examples. So we don't know much about what happened in the post-Reformation stages, but we do have one map which shows one small little gable, not dissimilar to what we see today. And it's a map from 1596, showing the abbey in its current location. Well, obviously in its current location. But this is really the only visual clue that we have, and that's from 1596, showing a single gable there. And then we have sort of other map evidence, and truly trying to understand its setting as the abbey of old as a country house. But again, the chapel sitting at this very interesting junction of three roads, and very much having a quite a prominence to the south and to the west. And we've done a bit of map overlays, just looking at sort of how the changes that occurred during the 1800s and early 20th century, and really how outbuildings started to be produced. And we've overlaid with the existing map, but it was quite important for us to understand outbuildings as the different uses of the chapel. And there was a post office in the early 20th century, and the outbuildings that related to that, because that is obviously part of the archaeology, and also an important consideration in thinking about how the site might be set out in the future. So what we've got from these overlays, so we've got what we've got today, but looking at these historic maps, and certainly from the 19th century, we've got a lot of outbuildings. And again, that's quite important, with some sort of longer ones along Borley Lane, and some earlier ones, some smaller ones that were potentially, this was an addition onto this one. So we do know that there was some significant outbuildings to the chapel during the 19th and 20th century, that aren't there today. And then we have a couple of key views, from well, we know it's from before 1892, the works that were carried out there, and we do have an 1892 publication by Kate Brown, which gives quite a good written description as well as a drawing. So these are the two views that we have. What we see here is not dissimilar to what we see today at St Andrews, but there are some key differences. There obviously isn't the stair and the little pentus that was built to put the stair in the late 19th century. And there is also this, there's obviously not the post office addition that we see today. There's possibly an outbuilding here, and what's clear is there is a lean-to here. Similarly to the pentus addition on this side, there is actually a lean-to there that is no longer there. And again, this other view from the 19th century, which very much a south-facing prominence at this road junction, a lovely hedge and picket fence, and all very romantic. But potentially an outbuilding. The jury's out about whether we think this is an outbuilding or not, or whether it's a hedge, but potentially there. But again, two important views. And what it does show is that this chimney has moved from where to where it is today, possibly as when they opened up the ground floor to make it slightly more formal in the late 19th century. What we are quite interested in is obviously the work that was done, the documentation in its Kate Brown description in the late 19th century. I mean, there was clearly an antiquarian interest in the place by then. And the work that was done in the late 19th century, I mean, does certainly reflect an understanding of the importance of the Abbey in its relationship historically to the wider Boxley Abbey estate. And so it's really interesting that this work was happening as the origins of the SPAB and the anti-scrape movement were taking place. And I think there is certainly an evidence in what we see today that the work that was undertaken in the late 19th century really was very aware of what they were dealing with and the importance of it through both the cave brand documentation and just the care that was taken and the interest in what was actually there. We do have quite a good description from the sale of 1890 that tells us what was going on there. So we do know exactly what rooms sort of exist and the layout, as well as stores and outbuildings and this kitchen garden. But what is really interesting that as soon as photographs started to appear of Boxley Abbey, of St Andrew's Chapel in the late 19th century and early 20th century, I mean, all of the views were very much from the south. So we had this wonderful southern elevation, but this Pentas addition is the one and the relocated chimney. But clearly, a lot of work undertaken in the late 19th, early 20th century, and a real pride in the place in a lot of the photos that we see. So these are some of the views that we know exist from that time. And a large amount of work was undertaken then, with some sensitivity. And the family that were involved was interestingly a master plasterer, which tells you a lot about the amount of late 20th century plasterwork late 19th century plasterwork that we see in the place. But certainly an interest in the families that lived there, and most recently. We have a couple of images, one from 1920, which shows we know that we've got some harder render, sort of post-war, starts to look a little bit less loved. And then we've got an image from the 1969 sale document following roadworks, and not looking dissimilar to it did in the early 20th century. And so where do we start? We obviously had some wonderful survey information produced by Terra Measurement that Matthew talked about last time. So some really, and using it photogrammetrically. I mean, when we first came across the building, it was all covered in ivy and very difficult to see. But it was relatively, I mean, the photogrammetry was incredibly useful for sort of pulling back the information that we had and really starting to get ahead around the archaeology and what was so important about the place. But certainly the origins of the chapel are very, very clear in the volume as you break it down. And certainly the east window is there is much more clarity in the brickwork now that the ivy has been removed, and the monastic outshot is much more evident. And then just taking some very simple sections through the place, using laser information just does give you a sense of the movement and the enormity of this great big chimney that was inserted in the post-Reformation period, and the floor that was put in, but also the sort of the level of dilapidation that we're also dealing with through some of the structural movements. And it does give you a real sort of sense of the evolution of the place and some of the tricky junctions that have been created as a result. But again, using sort of digital technology has been extraordinarily useful. So going back to sort of significance, I mean, we know the sort of three key phases of evolution. We obviously have the monastic period, where we had the monks, the priest lodging. I'm not entirely sure about the origins of this timber frame. It's not of a quality that matches the rest of the chapel, which raises a lot of questions about its origins. It's potentially reused or brought in from somewhere else. Like many timber frames, they were very modular and could be easily relocated. But we're hoping some of the archaeology will reveal itself through roofing works, etc. So this is ground floor, first floor. So we have the sort of monastic period, and then we have the post-Reformation period where they added the aisle. Effectively, they pushed out the southern wall and pushed out the western wall in a very high quality ashlar, and then inserted this enormous chimney through the middle and created these 4 rooms, 2 on each floor, as well as sort of service accommodation on the lower floor. The exact layout is still slightly unclear. There was potential that it was two dwellings at one point, but it's likely that there was partition through here, and that the timber frame stood relatively independently here. But we don't know entirely what's going on yet. We hope it will all reveal itself in good time. And then certainly the 21st century, the main things that were done were the insertion of the stair, at the opening up of this room, we believe, and the addition of the post office, and also these very interesting 1920s deco elements in terms of fireplaces and oilcloth linoleum floors, which are proving an interesting conservation challenge of trying to keep those in situ, or how we can remove them for conservation repair. So we, in terms of sort of making sure we truly understand, we produce what we call significance evolution plans, really trying to, historical evolution plans, really just trying to make sure we absolutely understand the different phases of development. And Susie Whitmore in our office has worked very hard on really getting her head around it all, from the various sources of information. And we believe this is an accurate summary of what we've got. As I say, the big questions sit around the timber frame and its origins. We know it's early, but we don't know if it was part of the original chapel and priest lodging, or whether it was relocated there at a later stage. But certainly understanding some of the 20th century interventions, and we know that we've got pretty much an entirely new floor through the whole house, from that period of the late 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century work. A lot of work was done then, and we think that there's a remnant of what was that earlier Pentas addition from before the post office was built in the early 20th century. So hopefully I'm not racing through this too much. I say Matthew's and Graham's talk gives us a lot more information on the history and significance of the chapel. But certainly it's really important for us to get our head around all of this before we start work on repair and thinking about interventions, so we have the clearest understanding. And then something that's quite controversial for the SPAB is significance plans, where we sort of look at we try to rank what's the most important, and how and between sort of high and medium and low, and how that should inform decisions that we make. As I say, the SPB don't sit comfortably with the idea of significance. The SPB approach is about valuing layers of fabric and development, and the idea that some layers are more important than others does sit quite not comfortably with the SPB approach. So. But we still feel it is an important thing to do. It's one tool in a palette of the work that we do, but it does also start to sort of create potential for where we might sort of think about intervention. And so a lot of thought about high, medium, low significance. The low elements tend to be the more modern ones. The fireplace that's been relocated here, and certainly the post office. And then the highest, obviously, being the origins of the chapel, but also the post-Reformation stage as well, which are a really important part of the history of the building. So I won't dwell too much on that, but yes, significance plans are important, but they are not. They are something that are challenging in terms of the SPAB approach to appreciating all layers of fabric and development. So, and then we've got the setting today well, it says 2019, but it hasn't changed. But yes, I mean, so we obviously, the motorway works of the late 20th century have completely altered the setting of St Andrew's Chapel, and are really probably the main contributor towards its becoming disused. Obviously, the motorway went in, and Grange Lane was created across the southern frontage. A lot of the garden was compulsory purchased, and a massive new gas main was built across here at the same time. A big Leylandii hedge, which hides the chapel completely from both Borley Lane, the historic road, and the new road, Grange Lane. But it does sits, when we first came across it, it was a house in the woods, completely overgrown. Didn't know it was there. This massive Leylandia hedge, but also a lot of self-seeded planting around the site. But the site is effectively this corner here. As I say, so a really challenging setting, both in terms of the access, which has been completely altered and restricted, but also in terms of the acoustics, the issues which are created by this motorway, which is raised, and there is now an underpass under here. So I'm sure there's lots I should tell you about the setting today, but certainly the best thing that the SPB have done, well, they've done lots of very good things, but certainly the immediate things that we did was starting to clear some of the planting on the site, so that the chapel revealed itself once again. This is the west elevation facing onto Grange Lane, and it was just extraordinary just seeing this all opened up and the ivy cleared, and really having a glimpse of what the house had been in the past, from Grange Lane. All of this modern paling fence is all part of the road scheme of the 70s. So after the clearing, I mean, we're left with this extraordinarily romantic view from the southeast, with the area cleared around, but most of the views, I mean, there isn't an uncharming view to be had, but we did feel that this view from the southeast, and certainly from the south, are the most significant in terms of what they tell you about the history, but also just in terms of what has been the historical approach in the setting. It's very much a house that has addressed the south, and we feel that this is the primary elevation. But the archaeology that is within that wall is just extraordinary. We're also very interested in the historical relationship to the abbey. So this is the hospitium, which is visible from the boundary of the eastern boundary of the chapel, and this is the view back towards the chapel from the hospitium. As I say, it's got a strong historical relationship with the wider abbey site, and we're quite keen to make sure that isn't lost. But also, it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. It is quite stunning, and it actually sits on the edge of the area of outstanding natural beauty, and the views and the relationship to the west and to the north are incredibly important ones in its relationship to historically with the abbey. So again, I promise you not many bullet points, but our development brief is quite clear. As I say, stemming from the aims of the project. Firstly and foremost, it is to repair and conserve the house as a desirable and saleable historic home, promoting the SPB approach and optimizing educational opportunities. Then we're looking at improving the relationship between the dwelling house and Boxley Abbey and the wider landscape, which I was just talking about. Then some of the more practical things, re-establishing vehicular and pedestrian access to the site. We've been doing that already. We've just had our permission granted to re-establish a southern approach over that gas main, but it's one of the first things that we needed to do for the small amount of minor works that are going on at the moment. We needed to make the site accessible. And then in the longer term, looking at how we can provide ancillary accommodation to the house, think for things like services, cars, mowers, the usual. It's a garage. And then looking at how we can use the landscape or the wider development to improve the acoustic environment. It is a real challenge of the site until cars become fusion powered and hopefully electric, and the noise from the motorways is reduced, but it is certainly a substantial challenge of the site. And then looking at options for providing additional accommodation to the house. not easy. That sits very very happily as a contained entity, but certainly to make it viable for potential buyers, it was important that we actually explored how it could provide additional accommodation if it needed to. And yes, going back to the viability, the deliverability and return on investment and capital outlay, it's really important to be looking at valuations against the potential cost of repairs and the potential cost of capital works. Really, that it's important that this project is both successful as both an exemplar of conservation, but also as an exemplar of sensitive and feasible development of a historic property. And we've also been challenged to see if it's possible to subdivide the site and get an additional dwelling, which wouldn't have an impact on the existing one, and that's something we have looked at. And not just about helping to offset some of the costs of repair, but also sort of to address this, the importance of all sites being part of a housing crisis, and whether they should be able to address it in some way, or that maybe the second dwelling was a way of keeping the existing dwelling sort of more contained and not having to extend it in some way. So looking at just various options for the site has been a really important part of our work. So and I can't not go over the SPB approach, which is incredibly important to all of us as scholars, and it really is about low intervention, about the use of the right materials. It's about retaining as much historic fabric as we can. It's about appreciating the sort of the pattern and the pattern of age. It's really about repair and not restoration. I will go through the list, but actually I'm not. It's a respect for age. But the most important one, I think, for us is this essential work only. I mean, we're looking at things like the roof, whether we need to completely replace it to do upgrading work, or if there's a way that we can undertake sort of gentle repair that will prolong the life of the roof and keep its wonderful character. And so there's been some big discussions. Getting the materials right, proven methods, the importance of good craftsmanship, but also certainly an important part of our work is about good new design and how it can complement the old. And then looking at sort of also emergency works and making sure that we are getting on with everything we need to at the moment. I would highly recommend the document that's been written by Matthew Slocum on the SPB approach, which gives a bit more detail about how the philosophy is applied to architecture projects, and makes the manifesto slightly more accessible in terms of the way that we can apply it to projects. And I'll try and explain how we've applied it to St Andrew's Chapel. So talking a little bit about the acoustic challenge and how what is extraordinary when you come to the site is, yes, it is quite noisy, but as soon as you sort of walk around quite close to the chapel on the north side, all of a sudden you get pockets of a lot less noise. And it's just extraordinary how a fairly simple physical barrier can bring a real calmness to the site. There is the Leylandii hedge at the moment, which does do something to a degree, but certainly it's a much more the denser physical object of the house, which does have the obvious effect. And we sort of took that away, and that had quite a strong sense of the importance of creating some sense of what's the word, calm, I guess, and a private garden where you can be outside in a acoustically relatively peaceful manner, and then things like water and things like that can be used, but certainly thinking about how we can get a viably enjoyable, usable outdoor space by using sort of physical landscape to address some of the noise concerns. But certainly it's very interesting going there at the moment and how just the impact of the house itself. So it started for us to think about, well, any development should sort of try to create extend that effect of acoustic calming effectively of the site. So a big part of our site layout has been about thinking about how we can address the acoustic issue. And so what we did feel that was, given the southern approach, and there's the existing pedestrian gate at the moment and the post office addition here, I mean, our instinctive response was off the new road here, Grange Lane, that we restore a southern approach and think about getting ancillary buildings in this location. The importance of that is that the main entrance has always been from the south as a dwelling house. And we feel that was quite important, and I talked about that elevation that is so incredibly charming. There is a secondary elevation to the road to the west, and that does obviously have the historic post office entrance. But certainly we felt that reinstating this as the primary vehicular entrance. This is a much quieter road. This is a bit of a rat run. It felt like the right thing to do, but also just about trying to restore some sense of the setting of the house and thinking about where ancillary accommodation may be able to help with some of the acoustic issues. And then it was also thinking about, if you did subdivide the site, it would make a lot of sense to have an access on the two outer corners. So that was our initial response, and it's been interesting that it hasn't changed very much, and we now have this permission in place to get that new opening, and that is going to be very helpful for some of the undertaking of the works that we need to do in the immediacy. And then it was about thinking about the house, and again, where the entrance might be, and just really doing as little as possible in how it might be laid out, where the kitchen might go, where we might get services. And it's all about really trying to stack up the services. There were two options really. We either had an entrance via the old post office, and which from the north, and that would sort of bring all the plumbing around from around that way. But we actually felt that with all the structural considerations and reinstating an entrance to the south, that actually having a secondary entrance from the north, but actually reinstating this primary entrance from the south really worked quite well in terms of the layout of the house as a sort of two reception rooms, using the post office as a study cum garden room. And using the one really decent sized space on the ground floor as a sort of kitchen and dining room, and how that manifested itself. And then where there's the structural issues in this southwest corner, we actually looked at how we could potentially get a small bathroom and so as an ensuite to the upper floor, and a utility room, and we'll talk about that later. But using the intervention in this corner to hopefully deal with some of the structural issues also. But we felt a lot more comfortable in terms of the intervention with this southern entrance and having 3 bedrooms upstairs. There is the challenge of how to create a bathroom, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But certainly we have moved forward with this option with the southern entrance. And at the moment, what we're looking at is with very, very few changes to the layout. We're looking at so 2 reception rooms with a central fireplace from both sides, reinstating that main entrance, turning the what was the post office store into a sort of utility and downstairs loo, with a tiny ensuite above it. And that does involve doing some substantial work on that floor too, which we're hoping will be combined with the structural improvements that we need to do. It's then looking at potentially making a new opening from this garden room here, and then reopening the entrance, the door that's been blocked between the priest lodging and this reception room, so that this would make a really great kitchen and dining room with a connection back to these reception rooms. It's a very low intervention layout. As I say, there's about 5 changes. One is reopening this historic opening. The second one is about this corner and stacking up all the bathrooms and utilities on this side of the site, so that we can get a fairly easy run out. The advantage of having the kitchen down here is that any bathroom waste, plumbing, etc., could all be internalized and kept within the reversible joinery, so that it wouldn't, and nothing would be seen on the outside. But yeah, it's a very low intervention alteration. The other area which requires substantial improvement is the repair, is the timber frame. And there was one location where we felt that it was appropriate to potentially make a new opening, where there was no sole plate and where the historic chimney had been relocated from. And we felt that that was also the opportunity to get a new opening and potentially linking to new development. But we did feel that that was, in terms of the intervention, but also the structural strengthening that was required, that had some real benefit of creating a new opening there. So very low intervention architecturally, and all interventions being in the context of wanting to strengthen and repair the major structural defects in the building. So looking at how we might get an ensuite into the upper floor and a utility room without altering the roof line, and is about taking away the dilapidated 19th century fabric that we've got, and strengthening the whole thing through this floor plane that will hopefully help us to tie this corner back in. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but certainly a fairly straightforward but not uncomplicated piece of design to get all of those that accommodation, that functional accommodation, into that post-Reformation addition to the house, to the chapel. So again, sort of how we can use it to address this major structural issue that we've got on the upper floor, and as I say, this is the lower floor where you can see the dilapidation, but there is a real need to tie the historic masonry back to the earlier chapel masonry, and we're hoping that we can do that, and introduce new facilities in the way that we do that. Then that's probably slightly more controversially is how you might partition a bathroom in a space of significance, and it might be a little bit too New York lofty for Boxley St Andrew's Chapel, but certainly how you might introduce a screen that would introduce a bathroom into this space, which is not insignificant, and we want to make sure that we can still appreciate this space while getting the connection through to the all important third bedroom. So the intervention would be a reversible glazed screen here to create a second bathroom. So I think it might be played down a little bit and maybe just be glazed on top, but certainly the starting point is something that's relatively translucent, that allows you to appreciate the volume of a room, even though it gives you some kind of acoustic and visual privacy. And then, yes, looking at reopening this blocked opening between which was between the chapel and the priest lodging, and that will be between effectively a reception room and the kitchen and dining area. And there are elements of 20th century joinery that we would definitely need to look at how we could reuse, and that's on the other side of this opening. So nothing wasted, but certainly we feel that there is significant advantage in getting that reopened. And then we've got this is the corner of the timber frame here, to the east, where we've got some fairly significant structural issues. The whole frame has been sort of underbuilt with rubble at some stage, and it's at a much higher level in this great big concrete gutter, pretty much holding the whole thing together. The sole plate is heavily degraded in a lot of locations, but also there's a new slab that has been dropped at low level, which has all sorts of damp issues. And then there's a 19th century, sorry, 20th century lacquer plaster finish on that, just to add to the interest. But it's effectively a single skin wall within an earlier timber frame, and lined out with no insulation or anything like that, lined out with lacquer plaster. And the challenge of what we do here, but what was interesting is that this area here doesn't have a sole plate. And was also where the chimney sat earlier, before this fireplace was put in the late 20th century, sorry, the late 19th century. So we do feel that this is potentially, at the same time as addressing these structural issues, and really how we can kind of consolidate and drop this floor level, this ground level safely. We are interested in whether we can make an opening that is in the context of helping to strengthen up the timber frame, and what we do around the existing slab, and dropping this floor level around all this rubble that's there at the moment. So that's something that we'll be doing very carefully in the near future, is looking at the ground level around here. And just looking at the exact state of what this masonry that exists behind this modern drain. But certainly we feel that that's the most comfortable place to create a new opening, and that does unleash all sorts of ideas about what you can potentially connect there. It is a little bit of an architectural cliche, the glazed link, but it's actually quite an important tool in architecture. But it also, in this case, acoustically, it could help to provide some real benefit, but also just an opening up to the garden and those incredible views to the south and to the west, to the east, and back to the abbey. So getting an opening where we feel that we can connect further was quite an important strategic consideration, and we do feel that this is the one place that's possible. And how you do that and how you might connect to more modern development. But we do feel that there are sensitive ways which allow you to still read the building, but can also help to weather some of the historic fabric. But there are good examples around, and it did sort of start to unleash some potential. One of the things that is extraordinary about the wider Abbey site is all of the walls of brick and ragstone, and there are a huge number left, and the SPB have been doing a lot of work during the working parties to consolidate and repair the walls, to help them to weather. But we were quite interested in sort of things which have been over the years built into the walls of the Abbey, and to the idea that openings are just created in what does appear to be a garden wall, but is actually sort of grottos and storage and penthoses and lean-tos and things like that. And that did have a bit of get us thinking about how we might be able to sort of address the wider development of the site. And yes, just the romanticism of openings in a wall, but the idea that things can be historically concealed behind them. And so thinking about the development of the site, we've done a lot of sort of really boring 3D modeling and sketching just to see how different volumes might impact on the historic volume, and thinking about sort of ancillary accommodation. It's not a big building, and it's very easy for new development to have a significant visual impact on a building. So just putting a garage next to the site and modeling that was slightly terrifying. It really did dominate and just was far too close, and would really have a negative impact on the overall volume and setting of this wonderful historic building. So thinking then, okay, we'll do the opposite, and we'll take it right to the other end of the site, to the boundary, and have a protective wall between the two, that could help to sort of create a much more private garden to to the north of the wall, and address some of the acoustic issues. And certainly that's been a big part of the design development work that we've done. And then thinking about, well, maybe we could get this a smaller development as part of that wall, a little bit closer to the building, that working with volumes and materials actually could still be quite sensitive, and how that might sort of be used as some accommodation close to the house, and thinking about the sort of the volumes and different sort of ideas along that, and just what an impact it might have in terms of the views of the existing building, from probably the two key views that we believe it to be, and sort of, yeah, so loads and loads of sort of considerations of what we might end up with. The idea of hiding a garage behind a wall, and having a slightly more expressed addition closer to the house, but of a smaller scale. And the importance of the materials that are still available locally. I mean, it is very much both the abbey walls, but very much parts of the St Andrew's Chapel is about Kentish ragstone, which is traditionally a very much it is used a lot more in rubble than it is as ashlar, as fine stonework. So, and it's interesting that the way that it's quarried now, very close by, I think Gallagher's quarry is about 3 miles away, but it does come out mostly as rubble. It isn't cut out as block, which does mean it is very much more, certainly in its contemporary quarrying, it's very much leaning towards a sort of a use as rubble, and skilled, beautiful rubble, but still rubble nonetheless. And they were quite interested in sort of how you could create sort of openings, and in using traditional materials, and sort of we're kind of interested in the idea of these sort of the squint windows that are found throughout the chapel and the priest lodging, and how they could actually, we could interpret them in a sort of contemporary way, but certainly this incredible palette of ragstone and brickwork that is found throughout the site is certainly something that we're keen to think about in sort of contemporary ways, but also the historic forms of gables and these sort of squint windows, and also thinking about sort of sustainability issues and whether there is such a thing as a beautiful PV tile. There's been a lot of trials of trying to create photovoltaics which can work well with a red roof, rather than these substantial black PVs, and that's certainly something we're looking at closely. These are tiles that have been developed in Belgium, very much for replacement of historic roofs, but thinking about the new elements and whether these could be integrated on the southern side. And also looking at sort of potential for educational and opportunities. The idea of an oak frame that could be built by volunteers as part of a working party is something that is an important part of the consideration of the design of any development that goes that might be planned. So where we are at the moment, we kind of interested in the idea of keeping the garage on the southern perimeter, but maintaining these important views through to the southern perimeter on the eastern perimeter, but maintaining these lovely views through to the chapel, to the abbey. We're still exploring the idea of a second dwelling potentially, but certainly the importance of this a wall which will help to create a much more private garden to the north of the existing dwelling, and then the potential to sort of create a very light touch porch between the wall and the historic building, so that we could also form a sort of a porch or a garden room that could link to both sides, but very much giving the historic building the breathing space it requires. And thinking about sort of the garage being very much an opening behind the wall, and potentially having PVs on the roof, so that the whole thing reads as a very low landscape that allows you to read the trees behind, but certainly gives the chapel the breathing space. And sort of thinking again about, you know, if that was the starting point, would it be possible to add some further accommodation around there? So using this opening that we've created, and whether it's possible to create some additional space that would work in well with the sort of the garage and the living room accommodation, but maintain these important views through to the east. And so we've just been playing with some ideas about sort of the subtlety of that, and we think it's possible without, as say, keeping the significance and the setting of the chapel. Yeah, and so we're talking to the local authority and to Historic England about these ideas at the moment as part of the pre-application process, and they've already come back with some very interesting feedback. But generally that we are going along the right lines, some elements of detail for further discussion, but certainly the ideas of materiality being very much tying into the ragstone of the historic building, but used in a more contemporary way, thinking about these squint windows and as a way of sort of reflecting the sort of historic forms that are found through the abbey, through the chapel. I'll get it right one day. But yeah, and in using these materials in a contemporary way, that again could be quite an interesting educational opportunity for doing sort of dry stone or even wet ragstone rubble walling, but in a fairly square and contemporary way. We feel could be really interesting. But certainly all about restoring this southern setting and this southern approach in a way that gives the historic building its dignity and breathing space back. But we've also been looking at the idea of maybe bringing the garage a bit more forward and hiding some of this development a bit more behind. I won't bore you with it, but some of the other ideas that we're looking at is having a slightly more prominent garage on the boundary. Bringing it forward, and that's really about sort of widening up these views and actually giving a slightly bigger garden, but really optimizing this perimeter with the views through to the abbey. So we're still very much a work in progress, and we're testing and modeling different views at the moment. But the idea in this option would be to conceal everything behind this wall as a low-lying pavilion of living accommodation. That may again have a sort of connection through to this kitchen and dining room in the main house. So very much a work in progress, and very much subject to pre-application advice and all sorts of consultation. And feel free to give your opinion on the on the website, which I'll give you shortly. But certainly the principles being a very light touch to interventions to the historic building. I'll talk about the repairs shortly, but certainly the importance of materials and the historic materials, but also the craftsmanship in relation to those materials. And this option, we're actually looking at how we can burn some of the clay that's on the site to create a peg tile that we would then use to clad the garage, both as tile hanging and as roof cladding in a slightly contemporary way. So really thinking about sort of materials as well as the craftsmanship and the educational opportunities, but certainly the importance of good conceptual design that's sensitive to the historic building, but is very much of its day, of its zeitgeist, which is a very important part of the SPAB approach. But certainly very low intervention when it comes to the historic building itself. And just to give you a sort of a sense of what a second dwelling may be, if the local authority supported it, we'd very much think it should reflect a rural vernacular in a contemporary way, and how it would sit in relation to the chapel as viewed from Boxley would have to be something very, very low key and very much secondary to the chapel on the site. And that's a kind of a view as it would be, and sort of a second dwelling sort of hiding in there, but certainly reinstating a very strong visual connection between the Abbey and St Andrew's Chapel is a very important part of our proposals. So to talk a little bit about repairs, I don't know how long I've been going for, but probably too long. Obviously the repair priorities, as Matthew talked about in the last presentation, the structural stabilization of the west elevation. We've been doing a lot of monitoring and we've done a lot of measuring, and we're looking at proposals. There's obviously issues with both the superstructure, being the everything above ground, and how it's not the walls aren't tied in effectively to the historic walls, but then the issues with the substructure, the foundations. So we've got both going on, and it's really an interesting debate about how you can address the two integrally with the SPB approach being one of lower intervention, if at all possible. So that's a work in progress and a very interesting topic of conversation for many on the technical panel and many beyond. Certainly looking at more basic structural repairs to the east timber frame, and again that would probably be in the context of a new opening that would help to strengthen that. Looking at the renewal of roof finishes and rainwater goods, and that's certainly something we're looking at as an emergency, a high priority project at the moment. Looking at perimeter ground levels and drainage, really important. There's all sorts of damp and groundwater issues on the site, which and getting those levels and the drainage sorted out sooner rather than later will really help the building to dry out. So basically stopping the water flowing towards the building and hopefully flowing away very happily, and that will be a part of the working party activities fairly soon. We do have a challenge with a lot of embedded timbers and how we repair and protect those while keeping this patina, which is so important. And then the repair and upgrading of windows and secondary glazing is certainly a very important part of what we're proposing. But there are some windows in quite a poor state, and how we can repair those sensitively rather than replacing them is an important part of our work. So really, very much at the moment, we've done a full condition survey and we've come up with sort of repair proposals. But interestingly, also thinking about sustainability, upgrading, and things like secondary glazing. We actually feel that there are opportunities to upgrade the fabric of the building with insulation, primarily this main roof, in a way that is reversible and is actually an interesting reflection of the history of the building. So at the moment we've got these timbers were never originally exposed. They were originally faceted like the post-Reformation edition. So there was lath and plaster over these timbers, which exist on the top floor of the west, of the top floor of the entire chapel. And we do feel that there is a strong argument for getting insulation back between those timbers, keeping all of the Victorian plasterwork, but getting insulation back between those timbers, and really doing a lot to thermally upgrade the building, and reinstating the lath and plaster finish over those timbers. And there's plenty of evidence that has been what it was in the past. There's elements of the reading still and the lath still existing in one of the cupboards, but certainly the lath marks are very clear on the historic timbers. So it's quite a bold but an important strategic move. It is reinstating something that we know is there. It does probably bring some element of significance in terms of reinterpreting and I'll try not to use the dreaded restore word, but to reinstate something that had been lost, that we have very clear documentation for. But it is also in the context of a very significant thermal improvement in the performance of the building, and we feel that that's a really important justification. And again, sort of looking at secondary glazing, but the idea of the structural repair right down to renewal of the slab and insulation, but a quite significant intervention, but all because it's in the context of a significant piece of structural repair. And then looking at opportunities for getting insulation, service runs, etc., wherever we can, but generally a light touch. But where we are making an intervention, then utilising that opportunity to undertake multiple tasks. Certainly, I was talking about the embedded timbers that we've got on the elevation and how we treat those. And really, the SPB approach is about consolidation and just not allowing them not to get any worse. It's actually a truss line that sits through this this west elevation of the priest lodging, and how we can consolidate them and just give them the weathering that they need to stop them getting any worse. And we're thinking that maybe we may have to render areas of this, but what sort of an impact that would have on the visual appearance in this wonderful patina of age that we see everywhere on the building. But again, looking at the sort of the windows, most of the windows are late 19th century, and are all repairable, but just different degrees thereof. And we do feel that repairing the windows and adding secondary glazing is the right thing to do. And talking about the sort of the damp issues that we've got in the floor, some big considerations. The most important thing that we need to do is to get the ground levels below those of the building, so that we can at least then start to monitor the levels of damp which are still existing within the floor. And we'd hope to not have to lift this floor, and to keep it in its existing state. That is going to be a significant challenge. So we've got to sort out the ground levels around and go from there. And so the repair considerations, thinking about slabs, we hope to keep them, but if we are going to replace them, we look at a very, very soft limecrete that we can get some insulation into. What do we put the floor finish? What do we make the floor finishes on the existing? They're pretty much concrete screed at the moment, but we've got these wonderful linoleum mats, which could be absolutely wonderful if we can keep them intact and repaired, and how we can undertake all the other repairs and keeping them intact, and how we insulate the timber frame cavities while also protecting the historic finishes. And there's all sorts of interesting ways of trying to insulate within a timber frame cavity. We've done some interesting thermal imaging, so at least where we know where all the concealed timbers are. The big question around the structure repairs to the west elevation, and building control versus a low intervention SPB approach, often are slightly in conflict. But it really is about working with building control to do as little as possible, but as much as necessary, and to protect as much of the fabric as we can. Again, we've talked about the embedded timbers. I'll talk about the roof repair shortly, and this extraordinary ongoing question about whether we should roof felt or not. It's one that will be argued about eternally. But I think in this case, because we are just taking a repair approach, there will be no new felt going into the building. The works which we're just about to undertake on an emergency basis are really trying to sort out the elements of the roof. We've done a huge amount of work with Richard Jordan and Ashford and Cranbrook Roofing to really assess the condition of the existing roof and to make sure that we can repair it rather than replace it. It's very much in keeping with the SPB approach, but also trying to maintain the patina of so much of everything around it. But we are repairing a substantial amount of the roof, but it's all traditionally bedded, and with timber pegs, and we are looking at the areas which do need renewal. Obviously, looking out for the eaves, the soffits, the verges, and the ridges. Interestingly, the post office modern roof is in the worst state and is the one area which needs full replacement. And then looking at areas where we need to address sort of carpentry repairs because of failures on the roof. And we're looking to undertake this work fairly soon in conjunction with the Working Party and Ashford and Cranbrook Roofing. And we're putting up a full scaffold around the whole building that's of triple width, so that we'll be able to have people come and visit, and have educational opportunities during those works over the next month or so. I've spoken way too much. I'm sure I could talk about services and sustainability, but certainly that's a very important one on the agenda, and making sure that it is how we can get services in a way which are concealed and don't have a detrimental impact on the beauty of the building, but as well as the archaeology below ground, certainly in terms of rainwater and foul connections. But also how we can bring in sort of secondary glazing and insulation elements, potentially PVs on new elements, but also how we heat the building, whether we look at a long-term ground source heat pump with trying to make it as low energy as possible. If we can avoid gas, even though we've got a huge gas main through the side, it would be lovely. But what we can do to really be an exemplar environmentally, as well as in a conservation approach.